The movie begins with a character named John, who is visibly anxious as he practices his shooting skills. It's clear that he's preparing for something important. John is later revealed to be a law enforcement officer, working alongside his partner. The two are conducting surveillance on a target in a specific area. As they monitor the situation, their target suddenly attempts to escape by getting into a vehicle. John, acting quickly, chases down the suspect and manages to stop him. However, during the ensuing struggle, John's partner is shot. The scene becomes tense as John frantically calls for backup. After the intense incident with his partner, John heads to a bar to unwind. At the bar, he meets a woman named Tina. They share a few drinks, and John finds himself drawn to her, intrigued by her presence. Their conversation is light and pleasant, but it leaves a strong impression on John. The scene then shifts to a lively party at a house where Tina is present with her young daughter, Bethy. Tina is in a relationship with a man named Casey, who is also at the party. As the night progresses and the party comes to an end, Tina decides to leave with Bethy, despite Casey urging them to stay overnight since it's late. Tina, however, is determined to go home. As Tina and Bethy walk home, they have a heartfelt conversation about Bethy's father. Tina talks about how much he loved Bethy when he was alive, but the conversation upsets Bethy, and she becomes emotional. Tina tries to comfort her daughter, eventually calming her down. To save time, they decide to take a shortcut through a less traveled area. As they walk through the shortcut, they are suddenly confronted by a group of men, Jimmy, Fritz, Lloyd, and Marvin, who surround and harass them. The situation escalates as the men assault Tina and forcibly take her into a nearby house. Bethy, terrified, manages to run and hide. Inside the house, Tina is brutally assaulted by the men. After the horrific ordeal, the men leave, and Bethy, emerging from her hiding place, finds her mother in a terrible condition. Bethy is devastated, and the scene ends with her crying beside her mother, overwhelmed by the trauma of what has just happened. Meanwhile, John and his partner are driving through town when they spot a distraught Bethy walking alone on the road. Concerned for her safety, John stops the car and brings her inside. Realizing something is wrong, he decides to investigate further and heads towards the house where Bethy was last seen. Inside the house, John discovers Tina lying lifeless on the floor. The brutal scene is shocking, and he immediately calls for backup. As the investigation begins, an ambulance arrives and rushes Tina to the hospital in critical condition. At the hospital, Bethy's grandmother arrives and tries to comfort her devastated granddaughter. Meanwhile, John arrives at the hospital and asks Bethy if she can identify the men who assaulted her mother. Although traumatized, Bethy bravely provides the necessary information. Acting quickly, the police manage to locate and arrest the men involved in the attack. They are brought to the police station, where Bethy is asked to identify them. Despite the emotional burden, she helps the authorities ensure that the criminals are put behind bars. Later, Casey, who had been at the party with Tina, visits the hospital. He brings flowers for Tina. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fick and Mr. Fick are desperate to find a way to defend their sons, who have been implicated in the brutal crime. They meet with Jay, a well-known and highly respected lawyer with a reputation for taking on challenging cases. Understanding the gravity of the situation and knowing that Jay's services come with a hefty price tag, they plead with him to take on their case. Jay is aware of the potential backlash and complexity of defending the accused men, and he demands a substantial fee for his services. The amount he asks for is far beyond what the Ficks had anticipated, putting them in a difficult position. However, Mrs. Fick is determined to protect her sons at any cost. In a desperate move, she offers Jay the deed to her newly purchased home as collateral, hoping it will cover the lawyer's fee. Meanwhile, John becomes increasingly concerned about Bethy and Tina after the traumatic events. His worry drives him to visit the hospital where Tina is being treated. Upon arriving, he finds Bethy sitting on a sofa, overwhelmed with emotion and crying. John sits beside her, offering comfort and reassurance in the midst of the chaos. A few days later, Tina is discharged from the hospital, still physically and emotionally scarred from the ordeal. Her mother takes her home, where Bethy takes on the responsibility of caring for her mother. She stays close by, ensuring that Tina feels safe and supported as she recovers. On the other side of the story, Tina is haunted by her traumatic experience and begins to have nightmares about the boys who assaulted her. One night, she wakes up screaming, overwhelmed by the vivid and terrifying memory of the attack. Her cries echo through the house, and Bethy rushes to her side to check on her. When Bethy enters the room, she finds her mother curled up in a corner, crying and shaking in fear. Soon, Tina's mother arrives, hearing the commotion, and together they try to soothe Tina, reassuring her that she is safe now. The next morning, in an attempt to find some normalcy, Bethy goes out to a cafe with a friend. However, Her attempt to escape the tension at home is quickly disrupted. While at the cafe, Bethy is confronted by a girl who begins to bully her. The girl turns out to be the sister of one of the boys who assaulted Tina. She aggressively warns Bethy to keep her mouth shut in court and not to testify against her brothers. Then, we see Tina with her lawyer Jessica, who is mentally preparing her for the trial. Jessica assures them that they will win the case and asks several questions of Tina. Then, she encourages her to stand up for herself and millions of other girls who do not get justice. The next day, we see John heading inside the courtroom. During this, Tina arrives with Bethy and her lawyer, and Mrs. Fick harasses her. Then, we see another lawyer named Jay entering and presenting himself as the defender. The trial begins, and Jessica presents her argument against the defendants and asks the judge for justice. First of all, she calls John and asks him several questions about the night Tina was assaulted. However, Jay keeps interrupting her and ruins her argument. Then, Tina is called, and Jessica once again begins asking her some questions. However, the judge does not seem to support her, and she begins to panic. Jessica asks her to come back to her seat, but Tina loses it and begins screaming at the judge for being unfair. John watches everything helplessly. Jessica asks the judge to make the criminals stand trial and demands justice, but Jay claims that Tina had been drinking at a party that night at her boyfriend's home. At the party, they consumed a lot of beer, and later Tina got into a fight with her boyfriend and left his place. Then, Tina went to Rocky Point Park with her daughter and met up with the defendants she knew. Then, she offered to trade money for sex, so she was not raped, it was consensual. However, after this, Tina demanded to raise the price, which caused the argument. Therefore, the lawyer states that his clients did not assault anybody and that Tina's statement is totally misleading and a lie. After hearing this, the crowd in the court begins cheering, and Tina suffers a panic attack. She begins screaming at the judge and breaks down, but her lawyer tries to calm her down. Then, John helps her up, and she leaves the court with her daughter. At night, John thinks about the injustice being done to Tina, and it makes him angry. Meanwhile, a doctor visits Tina and gives her some medicine to help her sleep. Suddenly, the door gets knocked on, and Tina's mother finds her lawyer. She gets mad at them for not defending her in court and asks her to leave. She tries to make her understand that she will do everything in her power to win the case. However, Tina's mother does not believe her and closes the door. Then, we see Tina awake in her room trying to take the medicine, but she gets mad and throws everything away. She gets out of her room and heads downstairs. She goes to a cafe and drinks beer. Her condition worsens as she walks around the city trying to pull herself together. However, when nothing seems to work, she decides to take her life by jumping from a bridge. As she is about to jump, she is pulled away by John, who reminds her that she has a child. Tina begins crying with desperation, and John tries to calm her down. He hugs her, and Tina cries her heart out in his arms. Then, he takes her back to her home. Meanwhile, we see Bethy getting back home from school. She calls her cat but does not find her anywhere. Then, she watches Tina with John. John warns Bethy to take care of Tina and asks her to keep an eye on her as she is not in a good state. Then, he gives his number to Bethy and asks her to call him if something goes wrong. Soon after that, Bethy hears the bell of her cat and goes out to look. As she comes out, she sees her cat dead and hanging on the door while one of the criminals teases her. She screams at him to leave them alone and heads back inside crying. After this, Bethy calls John and tells him everything, asking for his help. Then, Bethy digs a grave for her cat in her backyard and buries her. During this, Tina's mother arrives at their house, and Bethy quickly comes inside, pretending to be okay. Meanwhile, we see one of the criminals named Jimmy heading inside a bar where he loses $20 in a bet to Casey, who is drinking beer. Then, Jimmy threatens him and tells him what he did to Tina, but the owner of the bar stops the fight. After this, he leaves, and we see John sitting at the back, watching everything keenly. After some time, Casey heads out of the bar to go home and gets inside the car when he is suddenly attacked by Jimmy. During this, John arrives and shoots Jimmy, killing him. After this, he calls an ambulance for Casey. The scene shifts, and we see John being interrogated by two officers for shooting Jimmy. John tells them that it was purely done in self-defense, and no further action is taken against him. Meanwhile, we see Jay and Jessica with the judge. Jessica asks for more time, but the judge dismisses it. After this, both of the lawyers sit outside having coffee and discuss the case with each other. Jay tells her that the case will be dismissed soon, so she should not give any false hopes to Tina. Soon after, Jay meets with the boys and tells them to admit being guilty and spend 3 years in prison to get rid of the case. However, their mother, Mrs. Fick, argues and tells Jay that her boys did not do anything wrong, so they will not plead guilty to it. However, Jay tells her that there is always a risk involved in a jury trial, and it is his duty to inform them about it. He tells them that they will have to spend 20 years in state prison if they lose the case. Then, he tells them to take some time and decide their fate, but Mrs. Fick stands firm in her stance and calls Tina a liar. Meanwhile, we see John standing near Niagara Falls and thinking anxiously. The scene shifts, and we see Marvin and Lloyd getting a tattoo. During this, Marvin gets a call, and he is asked by an investigator to meet him. The investigator tells him that he works for Jay, and he has a solution for them. Marvin quickly heads out with Lloyd to see him. When Lloyd questions Marvin about the investigator, he tells him that this guy has some proof against Tina that will help them win the case in court. They reach Niagara Falls and wait for him, and suddenly John appears. First, he shoots Lloyd, and he falls into the water. Then, as soon as Marvin tries to attack him, John shoots him multiple times until he dies. The next morning, media and news reporters gather at Mrs. Fick's house and ask her about the boys. She tells them that Tina drove them away, but the media accuses the boys of escaping to another country and hiding from the case. Meanwhile, we see Bethy and Tina listening to the news. Bethy gets worried and asks if they will come back, but Tina assures her that they won't hurt them again. During this, Tina's mother arrives and asks Bethy to go shopping with her. As they are walking around the store, Tina's mother goes to check out a pair of shoes. When Bethy is alone, Fritz appears and threatens Bethy to stay quiet in court. Bethy begins panicking and rushes back home. Seeing her in a miserable state, Tina gets worried and runs after her. Meanwhile, Fritz receives a call from a woman named Lou Ellen. She tells him that she was his junior in school and that she has some evidence against Tina that can help him. She asks him to meet her at a motel, and Fritz happily follows. He reaches there and heads inside, calling her name. Suddenly, John appears and points his gun at him. He makes Fritz sit down quietly and asks him to write and confess what he did to Tina. However, he does not comply with John's demands, and shortly after, John shoots him as well. The next morning, we see Bethy and Tina packing their stuff. Meanwhile, John meets Jay and accuses him of defending the criminals, but Jay tells him that he is just doing his job and that he gets paid for it, and one day John might need his services as well. Then, Bethy comes to meet John with Tina. They both thank John for his help, and Tina decides to leave them alone. Bethy gets emotional and thanks John for being there for her that night and saving her mother, because if it weren't for him, Tina would not be alive today. Then, John calls Bethy his daughter and wishes her luck in her new beginnings in California. They bid farewell to each other as John receives a call for another investigation. This is where the movie ends. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you can watch more movies like this. Thanks for watching.